suddenly I was immersed in a bluish white light that was coming from a source off to my right. And there was this incredible energy coming from that source. And if you could imagine absolute love and absolute peace, that's what this energy was. And it was an overwhelming feeling that I just couldn't even imagine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Channel Within. Today, I'm delighted to have with me Dr. Tony Cicoria, and we will be talking about his life before his NDE and the day of his NDE, and then how life changed after this fateful event. Welcome, Dr. Cicoria, and thank you for being here with us today.
No, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm glad to be part of this.
Awesome. So, if you don't mind, let us start with life before the NDE.
Sure. I'm an orthopedic surgeon and also a scientist. And I lived a very busy life and worked 12, 14-hour days every day of the week. And I was going toward becoming an academic orthopedic surgeon. I was publishing a lot of papers. I was the chairman of a big spine meeting every year, and I was being groomed um, to replace one of my dear friends up in Syracuse at the university there when he retired. And plus, I was managing my regular orthopedic practice. So my life was very full. I was married and had 3 children. I was brought up as Catholic and even went to Catholic school for a few years, much to my dismay. Um, and I wanted to play sports, and they didn't have any. So I finally managed to get my parents to reconsider and let me go to the regular high school when it was time. But I was very science based and didn't have any particular formal beliefs about what happens when you die. At that time, I was pretty much oblivious to thinking about stuff like that because I had a full plate, if you will. But I knew that there was other things that had to be considered because I grew up in a house that was built in the late 1700s. It was an old stone house, and it had a visitor, and there was a spirit present in that house from the time I was a little boy, and it was always there. I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that there are other things that we don't understand. I think it's a good point to talk about the NDE.
Yeah, let's do
My
that.
my wife had a bunch of family members with birthdays in August. So in August of 1994, we rented a pavilion in a place called Athens, New York, which is just below Albany, the capital. And it was at a place called Sleepy Hollow Lake. And this was going to be where we were going to have the party at a pavilion right next to the lake. And it was a beautiful day when we got there early in the morning. And then we got everything set up. There were about 25 people, kids running all over the place. And the party was up on the second floor of the facility. And I was outside on the ground floor and running the barbecue. So I start doing my job and I'm not paying attention to anything else. But mid-morning, I thought, geez, my mom was not going to be there, so I wanted to give her a call, make sure she's okay. So I walk around to the front of the building, and where there's a payphone attached to the building, and it's right next to the stairs going up to the second floor. So I pick up the phone and I dial, and she doesn't pick up. And I thought, okay, well, she must be busy. I'll call again later. So I take the phone and I'm going to hang it up, and I've got it about a foot away from my face. And all of a sudden, I see this huge flash of light come out of the phone and hits me in the face. And then I hear this huge crack. And I knew exactly what it was. I mean, there's not much that sounds like a lightning discharge other than lightning. And I knew I'd just been hit, and it just threw me back like a rag doll. I went flying backwards. And all of a sudden, as I was going backwards, I had this very strange sensation of moving forwards. And it didn't make any sense to me. And I remember standing there going, what was going on? I know I got hit. I know I was thrown backwards. And now I'm standing here trying to make sense of it. And I look at the phone, and the phone is dangling where I was. And I'm looking around, and all of a sudden, I'm at the bottom of the stairs, and my mother-in-law is at the top of the stairs, and she's screaming. And all of a sudden, she's running down the stairs right at me. And I thought, what the hell? It's like when you see your mother-in-law running at you screaming, you want to take cover. And as she got down in front of me, I thought, what's going on? But she was looking at me like I wasn't there. I mean, it's like I didn't exist. And she got right in front of me, and she was looking off to her left, and she just took off to the left side. And I said, instinctively, just said, I'm going with her. So I followed her, and I took about 3 big steps. And all of a sudden, I was confronted with myself on the ground. And I remember thinking in my usual vernacular, I'm dead. And it was such a shock to me, no pun intended, that there was no sign, no signal. I guess I always imagined that when you died, there'd be something, bells or whistles or, music from the other side or somebody saying, follow me, buddy. But there was absolutely nothing. I was just standing there going, oh my God. And as it turns out, there was a lady who was standing behind me waiting to use that phone. She and her 13-year-old daughter. And as it turns out, she was a nurse. And so she instinctively gets down and she starts doing CPR. And I'm just standing there, and I'm looking around, and everybody's screaming and people are running around. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm thinking like I normally would. I'm thinking about what I'm seeing, what I'm doing, what I'm anticipating. And I realized that it was exactly the way I would normally be thinking. And I said to myself, oh my God, whoever I am, I always am. And I realized I was in spirit form. I was not in the body. And I realized that this body was nothing but a new set of clothes on my spiritual self, which is eternal. And and so at that point I thought, well, I guess there's no point in standing here looking stupid. So I thought I would go up the stairs to check on my family. So I walk over to the stairs. I start going up the stairs, and I'm looking down as I go up the stairs because I have a habit of tripping as I do that. And I'm looking down at my feet, and I see them start to dissolve. And I thought, whoa, this is getting really crazy now. And by the time I got to the top of the stairs, I had lost all form. I was just a ball of energy. And the stairs actually take a left and finish going up to the second floor. And I didn't bother. I just went right through the wall. And when I got on the other side of the wall, I came out right over the head of my wife, who was sitting there painting children's faces. I memorized who was in the line, what order they were in, how the furniture was arranged. I made a special note of all of that information. And at the time, I didn't know why. I wasn't even aware that I had done that. And that would turn out to be an important thing later on when we were comparing notes. Because at one point we had been asked to do a special interview on the A&E Beyond and Back television show. And I had drawn out all of the details of that moment and and gave them to my wife, and she I think for the first time realized that I was telling the truth, because she looked at me and she said to the people who were doing the interview, this is exactly the way it was. She said there's no way he could have known that without having seen it. And it was not anything that we'd ever discussed. So that was an important moment. And then, so as I was continuing on my pathway, which was diagonally through the room, I looked around and I saw all my relatives. And when I got to the roof and went through it, that's when things really changed. And suddenly I was immersed in a bluish white light that was coming from a source off to my right. And there was this incredible energy coming from that source. And if you could imagine absolute love and absolute peace, that's what this energy was. And it was an overwhelming feeling that I just couldn't even imagine. And as I'm standing there and I'm looking at the light and I'm feeling the energy of it, and I started looking around and I see that the rays of energy coming from this light are what build everything. And I could actually see how the energy was flowing through the trees and through all the things that I was seeing. And I realized that, oh my God, this is the God energy. I'm seeing it. And then my science brain starts kicking in and going, you could measure this. And I'm like, shut up. Um, and and at that point, I was like, I realized that, and I said to myself, this is the greatest thing that could ever happen to anyone, and be aware of it. And to know that this is the other side, to know that there is a force much greater than anything we understand. And it's love and peace. And and that is the energy of God. And so I was floating in this river of pure positive energy. I had no idea where I was going. As I'm floating along, I, I pass a wall, and the wall is like a collage of my life, and there's all these pictures on the wall, and if you look at the picture, then you would see a video of a moment in time, and but nothing. It wasn't something I stood and watched. It was just like, okay, I see all of that, and I got someplace to go. And so I continued on wherever it was taking me. And at that point, I was ecstatic, thinking this is the most unbelievable experience anybody could have. And I felt so fortunate and grateful to have had that much of it. And then all of a sudden, it was like somebody flipped a switch, and bam, I was back in my body. And I was so pissed. I was like screaming in my head, no, 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 I don't want to go back. And, I was just kind of given the intuition that it's not your choice, buddy. You're going back. I'm like, oh God. So I'm in this body again, and it hurts like hell. Where the lightning hit me in the face and then came out my foot, felt like somebody was taking a hot poker and sticking it in both places. And but I'm still unconscious. I can't move. I can't open my eyes, but I'm in there and I'm thinking, and I said to myself, well, something must have happened because she stopped doing CPR, and she's kneeling next to me, and it seemed like minutes went by before I could actually open my eyes. And I opened my eyes finally, and I look around, and I want to thank this lady for saving my life. And I I look at her and I say, "It's okay. I'm a doctor." And she just laughed and said, "You weren't a minute ago." And I was like, "Oh God, I'm just going to shut up because nothing's making any sense." And the police came and the ambulance was called, and I said, "I'm not going to the hospital." I said, "I'm not going to sit in the emergency room for 4 hours to have somebody tell me, yeah, you're alive. I already know that." Um, and so I asked my family to instead take me home to I could see my cardiologist and my neurologist friends, and so I could call them on the way and say, "Hey, this happened to me. Can you see me and take a look?" So they did, and they all said the same thing. Well, you're lucky that you're here, and looks like everything's okay. But it's going to take a few days for the dust to settle. See how you feel. And so I went home and I took that week off. And then at the end, and the one thing that was different for me was like I could look at you and know that your name is Mira. And but could I actually find that name? Hell no. I knew that I knew you, and I knew, I could look at everybody and say, I know all these people, but I could not say their names. It's like that was all in a drawer that was locked and somewhere in my brain. And I thought, okay, this is pretty strange. And it was like that for diseases and things that I knew like the back of my hand. I could tell you all about the problem, but damn if I could tell you the name of it. And so that was the one thing that was clearly different. And then after a week, it was gone. Everything went back to normal, and I was like, okay, what the hell did this mean? And
Wow.
I really felt like, there had to be a, a reason, there had to be a message to all of it, because it was too well orchestrated to be random. You know, the and I remember thinking about this and calculating the probability of what's the chance of getting hit by lightning to begin with, and then what's the chance that it would lose just enough of its amperage passing through the building that when it hit me, it didn't turn me into a French fry. It just stopped my heart. And and then on top of that, what's the probability of having a nurse or a trained
Nurse.
trained person standing there waiting just in case you got a little too much? And and I was like, okay, this doesn't fit in a random category. This had too many things that had to occur exactly.
Yeah, I have a question about the life review, if you will, the tapestry, the wall that you passed by, and it looked like pictures, highs and lows, and then videos could be running. So it
Yep.
seems like you were not required to stop. Were you able to um, process all the events
Hmm.
in your life, or not really as you
No,
were passing by? Okay.
not really. It was just, it was showing me that all of those things were there and recorded. But, where whatever I was floating in, um, wasn't interested in that. It was taking me someplace else.
Okay. And with that floating or a company, did you feel alone, or were you enveloped in love, or?
Yeah, I was enveloped in this river of what I call pure positive energy and peace. And it was an energy river that was carrying me, um, in spirit form right along with it. And it was the most comforting feeling you could possibly imagine, being in this energy. But it was very clear that it had speed and direction. It was taking me someplace, but I had no idea where. And I remember thinking, well, it's not getting hot, so maybe that's a good sign.
Thanks so much for sharing that.
One of the things that's been a real positive thing for me is the hospitals that I've worked at, um, after all of this became public knowledge. Um, they would ask me to talk to people who were dying, and it always really made me feel good to be able to talk to people like that.
What did
So
you tell them?
being here is just part of the process, and death is part of the process. We all have to go through this, and it's all part of our spiritual growth. And I said, when you leave this body, you will go to a place of absolute love and peace, and you will just be amazed at how incredible it feels. And you will be able to see the people that you have known in your life that have passed over, and you will be able to understand, all of the things that you don't understand now. And and I think that they found it comforting that they would, that there's some place to go after this, that it doesn't just end, and that they will see their loved ones who've crossed over. And I think that, it's very common in talking to lots of people who've gone through this process and come back, like I have. A lot of them have met with family members and had an incredible experience because of it.
How about we talk about how life changed for you after your NDE?
After I went back to work, about a week to 2 weeks afterwards, I started having this insatiable desire to hear classical piano music, which was a big departure for me because I was a kid of the 60s. There was rock and roll, there really wasn't much of anything else. And my mother had forced me to take piano lessons when I was 7 years old for a year, and which I did under the threat of life and limb. And at the end of that year, I said goodbye, piano, and I never wanted to see it again. And sports and fishing and things like that were much more important to me. And so now all of a sudden I'm having, at 40 years old, I'm having this incredible desire to hear classical piano. And it was really a huge departure. And so I was like, okay, I just kind of grinned and bared it. But then it got seemingly worse. And it was like, it almost became an obsession that I had to hear this. And so I finally went to a store in Albany because in my little town that I lived in, um, it didn't have um, any classical piano CDs. And so I drove to Albany and I went to the store, and it seems like when I walked in the door, this CD of Vladimir Ashkenazy playing his favorite Chopin just seemed to jump right into my hands. And I thought, okay, this is getting really kind of crazy now. But I buy the CD and I start listening to it, and I could not stop. And it was just so overwhelming. And I started making everyone listen to it. They made my family, and made them listen to it at work during surgery. And I'm sure everybody thought I was losing it. And then within a very short period of time, I think it must have been another 2 weeks of carrying on like a lunatic, that all of a sudden I realized it's not going to be enough to listen to this music. I need to learn how to play it, which was a big problem since I didn't know how, and I didn't have a piano. So that was going to be a bit of a challenge. But the next day, one of our babysitters comes by and says, I have to move, and I have an old upright piano that was my father's that I love, and I don't want to part with it. Could I store it at your house for a year till I get settled and then come get it? And I thought, well, this is fortuitous, isn't it? I decide that I want to learn how to play a piano, and the next day one appears. And so the piano comes, and I thought, okay, now what am I going to do? So I went to a music store to get a couple of books to try to teach myself how to play. And I also ordered all the music that was on that CD because I knew that at some point I needed to learn how to play them. And again, the magical thinking is just ridiculous here because I had no idea what it was going to take to reach that level of proficiency. But I was undaunted. I just started teaching myself. And I struggled at it trying to do that. After the lightning, about a month after um, the lightning strike, I have this incredible dream. And in the dream, it was like an out of body experience. I'm walking out onto a stage and I'm walking toward myself, and I can see myself. I'm sitting at a concert grand piano and I'm playing to this gigantic auditorium, which was a performing arts theater. And I even drew pictures of it. It was so real. Um, and as I was walking out there, I was thinking about the music and I'm listening to it. And all of a sudden it comes to me that, oh my God, this is not somebody else's music. This is mine. And so now I'm paying attention. And I walk up and I'm standing behind myself and I listen to the music. And I'm looking at the crowd and I'm looking at myself. And I'm just absolutely incredible that I'm just overwhelmed with this whole thing. And then the music has this loud crashing ending, and the place starts erupting with applause. And at that point, it woke me up, and I sat up on the edge of the bed, and I look at the clock, and it's 3:15 in the morning, and I'm like, oh my God. I walk out to that piano and I start plunking out the things that I heard. But I had no idea what I was doing. So I said, to hell with this. I'm going back to bed. I got to go to work here shortly. So I went back to bed. I got up at 5:30, which was my usual time. And then one day I was trying to learn a piece of music called the Fantasy Impromptu, which is one of the Chopin favorites. And I could not understand why when you play the music, the two hands don't line up. I mean, it was just a foreign concept to me. And I thought, who the hell would write a piece of music where the hands aren't coordinated on? And so I was struggling with it, and I'm banging on the piano. And my daughter's best friend Jackie was over at the house, and her mom had just come in to pick her up. And Penny Cypress, her name was. And Penny sticks her head into the piano room and she says, "What in the world are you doing?" And I said, "I'm trying to learn this piece of music, but it doesn't make any sense to me because the hands don't line up." And she looked at me and she says, "They're not supposed to." And she was a classically trained violinist, so she knew what she was talking about. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "It's what's called a polyrhythm. They're not supposed to line up." And I thought, oh. And at that point, she said, "You need to get a teacher." She says, "I'm not even going to try to explain this to you." And I said, okay. She recommended Sandy McCain, who was the chairman of the Department of Music at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York, which is where we lived. And so I called Sandy and I told her the story and asked her if she would take me on as a student. And she said, "Well, bring 3 pieces of music and I'll give you an audition and see if it's worth making the investment of time and energy." And so I did. And after I finished, she says, "Okay." She said, "I'll be glad to take you on as a student." She said, "Under one condition." And I said, "What's that?" "You are not allowed to play any of these pieces of music until I tell you you can." And I'm like, "Okay, why?" And she said, "Because you've already started to develop bad habits and you have no foundation for what you're trying to do. And you have to have that if you want to be successful." I'm like, okay. So I put all of those pieces of music away and I started at the basics, you know, learning my fingering, learning the scales, learning all of the stuff that that people learn when they first start. And we met every week for 2 hours, and that continued on for many years. And then I started in 2002. So that was in 1998 that I started taking lessons. And in 2002, I started going to a piano camp for adults called the Sonata, which is in Bennington, Vermont. And it was an incredible place. It was an old convent that had 30 plus rooms. Every room has a piano in it. And so when you're a guest there, you have your own piano and you can play till your heart's content. Doesn't matter what time of the day or night it is. It's a total indulgence. But everybody else is of the same mindset. So it works. And at the end of the week, everybody has to perform one piece of music that they've been working on. And so that's what I started doing, and I love doing it. But at the same time, I'm still learning how to play, and I'm progressing pretty rapidly. And then, but the music, whenever I sat down at the piano or I was quiet, the music from the dream would start playing in my head. It was always exactly the same. But it was like a little 2-year-old child. It's like, hey, Daddy, play with me, play with me. So if I didn't work on it every day, it would really become intrusive. And I thought, okay, this is pretty strange, but it's my whole life has been pretty strange up to this point. And so I started trying to play that music that was constantly playing in my head, and it would start playing even when I didn't want it to. If I was I was doing surgery or something, and I'm trying to concentrate, the music starts playing. I'm like, no, 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 I got to pay attention to something else here. And it continued like that. So I started incorporating working on that while I was doing my lessons. And there came a point where, I was actually able to play parts of it. And, I would play it for my teacher, and, and she would ask me questions about it, or I would ask her questions. How would I write something like that? After, I would play it, and I'd say, this is not a typical rhythm. What is it? And she'd listen to it and she'd say, well, that's 4/5 on this particular type of notes. And I'm like, oh, Jesus, this is too complicated for me. And that was, I kind of put that on the back burner, but it was always cooking. And so I started going to the piano camp. Now I'm going back to the piano camp. And I went every year. And in 2006, when I went, the owner's sister was there, Erica. And Erica was a concert pianist, and she was also the #1 salesperson at Steinway in New York. And we got talking about, what I was working on, and we talked about the lightning and the music, and she said, I think it's really remarkable that you have not been playing for a long period of time, and you're already playing pieces that people who've been playing for 20 years struggle with. And so she was quite impressed with the aptitude that I had for playing this stuff, with the short amount of training that I had. But I just kind of took that with a grain of salt. I didn't know what to make of that. But after that meeting in 2006, we went our separate ways. And a month later, I get a phone call from Oliver Sacks, the famous neurologist in New York City. And he's also the author of the book Awakenings and discovered the treatment for Parkinson's. And Dr. Sacks called me and says, I got a phone call from my friend Erica. And of course, I had no idea they were friends. And he said, she told me about this wacky guy in upstate New York who's got struck by lightning and has had all this music stuff happening. And he said, I want you to come to New York and be one of my patients because I have a collection of people like you. And I said, God, I'd love to. So in August of 2006, I got to go and spend a full day with the famous Oliver Sacks, which was an absolute incredible experience. And so I went to his house. I didn't know that he was an accomplished pianist either. And I think must have been the fourth or fifth story of this building. There's a concert grand piano in his living room that was his father's Bechstein piano. And I'm like, holy crap. He sat down and started playing a bunch of things from memory. And I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. But at the end of the day, we had dinner at his house, and I'm standing there in the doorway and saying goodnight. And he looks at me and he says, the music from the dream went to an awful lot of trouble to get here. The least you can do is write it. And I thought, oh my God, this is coming from one of the greatest minds in the world. And when I went home, first thing I did the next day was I went to a computer store and I found a program for writing music called Sibelius, which is essentially writing music for dummies like me. And you can play on an electronic keyboard, goes into a computer, and it spits out hard copy. And then you can look at it and see, okay, I did this right, I didn't do that right. And you can listen to it so that, you can correct whatever it is that's not correct. And so I started this process, and it took me 7 months working every night from the time I got home until I started to not be able to see straight. And at the end of that time, I had finished the music 2 weeks before piano camp. So I printed it out and I took it up, and that was what I was going to play for my piano camp group on that week in May. And I did. It was well received. And then the last day of the get together, I get a phone call, and it's Oliver. And he says, I want to use your story in my book. And I thought, okay, I don't have anything to hide. And he says, good, because it's coming out, you're chapter 1, and it's coming out in the New Yorker magazine July 23rd. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. He says, yeah, it'll be fine. I'm like, okay. Well, it wasn't fine. All hell broke loose. I started getting phone calls all over the place. And then one of the first calls I got was from a friend of mine, Carlton Clay. Carlton was the head of the Department of Music at the State University of New York in Oneonta. And they have a performing arts center. And he says, I just got my copy of the New Yorker magazine and was reading about you. And he said, I would love if you would come and teach a class. And I thought, sure, I'd love to do that. And then a week later, he calls back again and says, you know, I'm getting so many people asking questions about this. He said, would you consider playing the music for the class when you teach it? And I said, sure, I'll do that. And then it was okay. And then about a month later, he calls back and says, you're just not going to believe the number of calls I'm getting about this. And people want to hear the music. And I said, okay. And he says, would you consider doing a concert at the Performing Arts Center? And I said, no. I said, I don't have the faintest idea how to do that. I'm not prepared. I don't have the time to do it. I can't do it. Somehow he talks me into it. And now this is a fall sometime. I don't remember exactly when the call was. And I think it was like October of 2007. And I knew that I couldn't handle this. So I called Sandy, my piano teacher, and I said, Sandy, and she knew Carlton well. And I said, will you, Carlton talked me into this. I said, is there any way you can get me ready for it? And she says, yes, but it'll take 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you have to commit to it or I'm not going to do it. I'm like, okay. So, I'm thinking, how am I going to possibly do this? And so, at that time, Sandy started working with me. We did 3 hours a day of how to walk in, how to walk out, how to talk to the audience, how to play the music so that everybody can hear it. All of the things that go into this. And at that point, I was so overwhelmed with it all. And I continued working with her. And then about a month before the concert was scheduled for January 29th, which was my birthday, in 2008. So I was kind of looking at it as a rebirth, if you will. And it's Carlton again. And he says, you're not going to believe this. And I said, no. I said, the answer is no. And he says, I haven't even told you yet. And I said, it's still no. I said, I can't do any more than I'm doing. And he says, you're not going to have to do anything more. He said, but I've got 3 television studios that want to film this. I'm like, oh my God. I said, I don't have any idea how to do this. And he gives me this big song and dance. I'm like, okay. And so now, it's coming down to the wire. I had to memorize all the music. I had to learn how to play it for a huge audience. And now it's going to be filmed as well. And so the night of the concert, I go to the green room to say my prayers. And I said to God, I said, you went through an awful lot of trouble to get me here. I said, don't embarrass us both and leave me out there alone. I said, because I'm not going to be able to do it by myself. And I got out there and, I talked to the audience about, where the music came from. And then I played the music from the dream and two other pieces that had come in similar ways, not in dreams, but just immediate downloads um, that I was, able to capture and write. And I got through it, and everybody seemed to be happy with what had happened. And then it pretty much took on a life of its own. Um, I started playing the music all over the country um, at different functions and on television crews coming to the house, playing it in different countries. It was crazy.
What did you call the music that you heard in the dream?
The music from the dream was, I called it the Lightning Sonata. And when I played it for my piano group the first time, the head teacher she said, the music is great, but you can't call it a sonata because it's not in sonata form. And I said, well, what form is it in? She says, music, from a musicology standpoint, it's a fantasy. And I said, okay. And she said, but you can subtitle it anything you want. So we wound up agreeing I could call it Fantasy Opus 1, The Lightning Sonata, which is what I did. And that's what it's on the label as. And somebody wants to hear it. It's on just about all of the big um, music websites. I think it's on Amazon, it's on Spotify, and all of those different things.
This was so lovely, Dr. Cicoria. I really enjoyed listening to the NDE and then the stories that ensued. And I have three quick questions for you.
Sure.
What brings you joy and laughter these days?
My grandkids.
Beautiful. What would you say to Tony, who is about to embark on this wonderful journey?
Hold on to your hat, buddy. It's going to be a rocky road.
And if you have one final blessing or message to anyone listening, what would that be?
Live every minute to the fullest. You never know when it's your turn. You never know if there's going to be another day or another minute. That's one thing. Another thing is always live life as a service to others. That's the pathway to spiritual development and spiritual growth, and ultimately to be able to rejoin the source. And the third thing is to know that this is not all there is. Our spirit, our soul is eternal, and the body dies. So what? It's just part of the process, and you discard that body, you go to the other side, and you review what you've done, and you formulate a new plan of things that you want to learn or you need to learn, and you come back.
Well said, Dr. Cicoria. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh,
And I,
you're
and
welcome.
I and I hope everyone listening enjoyed this as much as I do.